So we've just seen the old guard of group selection take a rather dramatic exit stage left. But does that mean the story ends there? Not quite. It actually leads us into a fascinating debate that really gets at the heart of how evolution shapes what we see and what gets passed on. Think about Richard Dawkins' classic analogy. The cake recipe is the genotype, the blueprint, the stable replicator, the actual taste of the cake. That's the phenotype, the outcome, what people actually choose. Now, the genotype chauvinists, let's call them the recipe purists, they say, look, it's all about the recipe. That's what gets copied, generation after generation. But then you have the phenotype folks arguing, hold on, people don't buy the recipe, they buy the taste. And the taste isn't just about the recipe. Oh no, it depends on the baker's skill, the altitude, the oven temperature. It's a whole interaction. So, if your cake business isn't selling, do you tweak the recipe or hire a better baker? This simple question captures the core tension. What exactly is being selected for, and what drives the choices we observe? So, can everyone just get along? Well, evolutionarily speaking, maybe. The bleeding heart answer, which often makes sense, is that it's not an either-or situation. We live in a rainbow-colored tent of evolutionary diversity, as the text puts it. Different circumstances bring different levels of selection to the forefront. Sometimes, zooming in to the single gene level is most informative. Other times, looking at the whole genome, or perhaps just one specific trait like eye color or aggression, or even the entire package of traits that define an organism is key. It's context dependent. When does the gene matter most? When does the phenotype? When does the environment mediate? This natural flexibility leads us directly to the concept of multi-level selection. It's not about choosing one level over others, but recognizing that different forces can be acting simultaneously, sometimes in concert, sometimes in conflict. It's acknowledging complexity, not simplifying it away. Okay, so we've got the recipe versus taste debate covered. But wait, there's another layer. Sometimes, what really changes sales isn't the recipe or the taste at all. Maybe it's the advertising, the fancy packaging, or how people perceive the product. Is it a daily staple or a luxury item? And sometimes it's about tying the product to a specific audience or ideology. Think about brands that emphasize fair trade, or niche bakeries catering to specific cultural groups, like the Nation of Islam's Black Muslim Bakery, or restaurants deeply tied to certain religious beliefs, like Chick-fil-A. In these cases, the actual recipe and taste can be trumped by ideology in purchasing decisions. This is where neo-group selection slots into our multi-level framework. It's the idea that some heritable traits might be bad for an individual, but good for the group. Think cooperation, pro-sociality, things that pop right out of game theory analyses like the prisoner's dilemma, where strategies like tit for tat help cooperators find each other. Formally, it's when strategy A beats strategy B in a head-to-head contest, but a group composed entirely of Bs outcompetes a group composed entirely of As. It's group advantage trumping individual advantage. Let's make this concrete with a great example from poultry farming. Imagine you want maximum egg production. Your strategy? Take the single best egg layer from each of your chicken groups and form them into a superstar team. You'd expect them to be incredibly productive, right? Wrong. Their egg output plummets. Why? Because what made each superstar queen in her original group was her aggressive pecking of subordinates. This stress reduced fertility in the other chickens. Put all these mean girls together, and guess what? A group of less aggressive, maybe slightly less productive chickens will actually lay more eggs overall. It's a perfect illustration of neo-group selection. A trait, aggression, that was adaptive for an individual, allowed her to dominate resources and potentially out-reproduce others within her group, becomes maladaptive when shared by a group competing against other groups. The group dynamic flips the script. Now it's crucial to understand what neo-group selection is not. This isn't about some mystical idea of animals behaving selflessly for the good of the species. That's a common misinterpretation, often used to dismiss the concept. Instead, neo-group selection describes a specific circumstance, a genetically influenced trait that is advantageous for an individual in a particular context, like dominating resources within a group, becomes disadvantageous when that trait is widespread within a group, especially when that group is competing against other groups. It's about the interplay between individual advantage and group-level consequences under competitive conditions. The genetic basis is key here. It's not just about temporary social dynamics, but about heritable traits shaping group outcomes. So, why did this idea die out initially? There's been considerable resistance. Part of it is visceral, especially among the old guard who felt group selection had been thoroughly debunked. Phrases like playing whack-a-mole with group selection sentimentality capture that frustration. But there's also a more fundamental resistance, distinguishing the bad old group selection from the more nuanced neo-group selection. Many accept the latter conceptually, but think it's very rare in nature. Maybe so across the animal kingdom. But here's the kicker. In humans, neo-group selection likely plays out with great frequency and consequence. Think about historical competition for hunting grounds, pastures, water sources. Add layers of cultural amplification, ethnocentrism, religious intolerance, race-based politics, and the intensity of between-group selection increases dramatically, while within-group selection might decrease. Economist Samuel Bowles famously argued that intergroup conflict like war acts as the midwife for intragroup cooperation, what he called parochial altruism. It's the pressure cooker effect. Consequently, most in the field now accept multi-level selection and see a plausible role for neo-group selection, particularly in understanding human behavior. Much of this re-emergence owes a huge debt to two scientists. First, David Sloan Wilson from Binghamton University. For decades, he championed neo-group selection, often facing dismissal. He wasn't necessarily calling it neo. He saw it as old-style group selection finally getting the scientific rigor it deserved. He built a case through extensive research, studying everything from fish social structures to the evolution of religion. Slowly, he started convincing some people, most importantly the second giant, Edward O. Wilson of Harvard E.O. Wilson, arguably the most important naturalist of the latter half of the 20th century, an architect of sociobiology itself. He had long dismissed D.S. Wilson's ideas. Then, a few years ago, the octogenarian E.O. Wilson did something extraordinary. He decided he was wrong. And then, he published a landmark paper co-authored with the younger Wilson, titled Rethinking the Theoretical Foundation of Sociobiology. Talk about respect. My respect for both these scientists, as people and as scientists, is enormous. It shows intellectual honesty and the willingness to revisit and revise core paradigms. This reconciliations between the proponents of different selection levels led to something resembling détente. It's not a complete resolution of all debates, but a recognition that multiple levels of selection can operate concurrently. Think of our understanding of human behavior evolving from a three-legged chair, supported by individual selection, kin selection, and reciprocal altruism. Adding the fourth leg of group selection, particularly in its neo form relevant to humans, makes the whole structure more stable, more robust. It acknowledges that our evolutionary story isn't just about genes competing within individuals or families, but also about the dynamics of groups themselves. Alright, let's pivot to humans. Where do we fit into all this? Our behavior seems to match predictions from these models, but things get complicated fast. Let's start by clearing up some basic misconceptions. First, we are not descended from modern chimps, or any extant animal for that matter. We share a common ancestor with chimps going back roughly 5 million years. Since then, both lineages have evolved significantly. Genomics confirms chimps haven't been sitting still, they've been busy evolving too. And what about which ape is our closest relative? Popular stereotypes might lean towards chimps if you like country music, or bonobos if you prefer organic food and oxytocin talk. The reality is, we're equally related to both. We share about 98 to 99% of our DNA with both species. Svante Pääbo's work even showed tiny fractions of the human genome are more closely related to bonobos than chimps, and vice versa. Despite our wishes and excuses, we're neither bonobos nor chimps, just humans. Okay, so we're humans. Now, the irresistible question. Are we fundamentally a pair-bonded species like gibbons, or a tournament species like baboons or elephant seals? Western civilization gives us no clear answer. We praise stable, devoted relationships, yet we're titillated by alternatives and succumb at high rates. Once divorce is legal, many marriages end in it, but often driven by serial divorcers, not widespread dissatisfaction. Anthropology doesn't help much either. While polygyny is common in many cultures, most people within those cultures are socially monogamous. Would they be polygamous if they could afford it? Probably. What about our physical differences? Men are taller, heavier, need more calories, live shorter lives than women. More dimorphic than monogamous species, less than polygamous ones. Same with subtle things like canine length. Human males have proportionally bigger testes and higher sperm counts than gibbons, but pale compared to chimps. And imprinted genes reflecting intense intersexual genetic competition are numerous in tournament species, non-existent in pair bonders. Humans? Some, but not many. Measure after measure, we're neither classically monogamous nor polygamous. As poets and divorce attorneys know, we're profoundly confused, mildly polygynous, floating somewhere in between. At first glance, we seem like a textbook case of individual selection-driving behavior, maximizing reproductive success, being an egg's way of making another egg. Consider the perks of powerful men throughout history, polygamy. Pharaoh Ramses II, now associated with condoms, had 160 children. Ibn Saud, founder of Saudi Arabia, had over 3,000 descendants within half a century of his death. Genetic studies suggest around 16 million people today are descended from Genghis Khan. More recently, figures like King Sobhuza II of Swaziland, King Saud of Saudi Arabia, and dictators like Jean Bedel Bokassa fathered over 100 children each. This relentless drive to maximize reproductive success is starkly evident in the most common cause of individual human violence, male-male competition for direct or indirect reproductive access to females. And tragically, it's linked to the dizzyingly common male violence against females for coercive sex, or simply as a response to rejection. Plenty of human behaviors would make sense to a baboon or an elephant seal. But that's only half the story. Despite Ramses, Ibn Saud, and Bokassa, numerous people forego reproducing entirely, often due to theology or ideology. The Shakers, for instance, are heading towards extinction because of their adherents' celibacy. And then there's the supposed selfishness of human genes, driving individual selection, having to accommodate individuals sacrificing themselves for strangers. This brings us back to the earlier point about competitive infanticide. Does anything like that occur in humans? Psychologists Martin Daly and Margot Wilson looked at patterns of child abuse and made a striking observation. A child is far more likely to be abused or killed by a step-parent than by a biological parent. They termed this the Cinderella effect, readily framed as parallel to competitive infanticide. However, this finding has been robustly criticized. Some argue socioeconomic status wasn't controlled for properly. Step-parent households often face more economic stress, a known cause of aggression. Others suggest detection bias, abuse by step-parents might be reported more readily. And replication efforts haven't been universally successful. So, while suggestive, the jury is still out on the Cinderella effect as definitive evidence of competitive infanticide in humans. Moving on to kin selection. How well do humans fit here? Pretty well, actually. We've seen examples like fraternal polyandry in Tibet, the weirdness of women liking the smell of their male cousins, linked to avoiding inbreeding, and the universality of nepotism. Humans are obsessed with kin relations culturally. Look at the elaborate systems of kinship terms, just browse Hallmark cards. Unlike most primates who leave their natal group around adolescence, humans maintain contact with their family of origin even after marriage. Clan vendettas occur along lines of relatedness, from New Guinea Highlanders to the Hatfields and McCoys. We typically bequeath money and land among our descendants, not strangers. Dynastic rule from ancient Egypt to North Korea and modern political families like the Kennedys and Bushes screams kin selection. Experimental evidence backs this up. In a classic Buzz dilemma scenario, saving one person versus a dog, whom people choose depends heavily on degree of relatedness, sibling, grandparent, cousin, foreigner. Legal systems often protect relatives from testifying against them, and neurological studies show damage to the VMPFC, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, can make people unemotionally utilitarian, choosing to harm family to save strangers. The evidence for kin selection in humans is strong. There's a fascinating historical example illustrating how deeply counterintuitive choosing strangers over kin feels. This is the story of Pavlik Morozov, a boy in Stalin's Soviet Union. According to the official narrative, young Pavlik was a model citizen, denouncing his father for black marketeering, leading to his father's arrest and execution. Soon after, Pavlik himself was killed, allegedly by relatives who felt more strongly about kin selection. The regime's propagandists embraced the story. Statues, poems, songs, schools, and opera, a hagiographic movie. Pavlik became a martyr for the revolution. But here's the twist. When Stalin heard about Pavlik, his reaction wasn't hope for the future. According to historian Vayas Leolevicius, Stalin snorted derisively and said, "What a little pig, to have done such a thing to his own family." Only then did he unleash the propagandists. Even Stalin, the man benefiting immensely from such fealty to the state, intuitively understood the deep-seated mammalian principle. Something's wrong with that kid. Blood is thicker than water, even for dictators. Of course, until you look more closely. Yes, we're obsessed with kinship terms, but they often don't align perfectly with biological relatedness. We have clan vendettas, but we also have wars where combatants on opposing sides are more closely related than fighters on the same side. Brothers fought at Gettysburg. Relatives oversaw World War I. Intrafamily violence exists, though rare when corrected for time spent together. Patricide, often revenge for abuse. Fratricide, surprisingly often not over major issues like stolen birthrights, but over long-standing irritants boiling over lethally, like the Florida man charged with killing his brother over a cheeseburger dispute. Honor killings persist in parts of the world. Parent-offspring conflict, sometimes involving infanticide, often involves profound mental illness or abuse. While we bequeath wealth to descendants, we also give charitably to strangers globally and adopt orphans. These actions violate strict kin selection logic. And in systems like primogeniture, birth order trumps degree of relatedness in inheritance. So we have textbook examples, but also dramatic exceptions. Why these deviations? I think it often reflects how humans go about recognizing relatives. We don't do it with certainty like rodents using MHC-derived pheromones, nor do we imprint on sensory cues like voice during fetal life. Instead, we do kin recognition cognitively by thinking about it. But crucially, not always rationally. As a general rule, we treat people like relatives when they feel like relatives. A fascinating example is the Westermark effect, demonstrated by marriage patterns among people raised in the Israeli kibbutz system. Communal child-rearing meant kids knew their parents but lived, learned, played, ate, and slept with their age cohort. Anthropologist Joseph Shepard examined thousands of marriages between kibbutz members. Out of nearly 3,000, there was no single instance of two individuals marrying who had been in the same age group during their first 6 years of life. People from the same peer group had loving, lifelong friendships, but no sexual attraction. I love him 30 pieces, but am I attracted? Yech feels like my sibling. Who feels like a relative? Someone with whom you took a lot of baths when both were kids. How about this for irrationality? Back to the person versus dog dilemma. The decision depended not only on who the person was, but also on who the dog was. Remarkably, 46% of women in one study would save their dog over a foreign tourist. What would any rational baboon conclude? That those women believe they are more related to a neotenized wolf than to another human. Why else act that way? I'll gladly lay down my life for 8 cousins or my awesome labradoodle Sadie. This human irrationality in distinguishing kin from non-kin takes us to the heart of our best and worst behaviors. It's because we can be manipulated into feeling more or less related to someone than we actually are. When it's the former, wonderful things happen. We adopt, donate, advocate, empathize. We see similarities in people very different from us. This is called pseudo-kinship, and the converse. One of the tools of the propagandist and ideologue drumming up hatred of the outgroup blacks, Jews, Muslims, Tutsis, Armenians, Roma, is to characterize them as animals, vermin, cockroaches, pathogens. So different that they hardly count as human. This is pseudo-speciation, and as we'll see, it underpins many of our worst moments. Finally, let's touch on reciprocal altruism and neo-group selectionism, which together form the third leg of the stool for understanding human behavior. This is arguably the most interesting stuff. We're the species with unprecedented cooperation among unrelated individuals, even total strangers. Dictyostelium colonies, slime molds, are green with envy at our ability to do a wave in a football stadium. We work collectively as hunter-gatherers or IT executives. Likewise, when we go to war or help disaster victims halfway across the world, we work as teams to hijack planes or to award a Nobel Peace Prize. Rules, laws, treaties, penalties, social conscience, an inner voice, morals, ethics, divine retribution, kindergarten songs about sharing, all driven by the evolutionary advantage of non-relative cooperation sometimes. A recent anthropological finding highlights this. Studies of over 5,000 people from 32 hunter-gatherer societies showed only around 40% of people within bands are blood relatives. This means hunter-gatherer cooperativeness, the social building block of 99% of hominin history, rests at least as much on reciprocal altruism among non-relatives as on kin selection. So humans excel at cooperation beyond kin. This tendency, combined with the revival of group selectionism focused on groups of nice chickens outcompeting groups of mean ones, is central to understanding cooperation and competition among human groups and cultures. So humans deviate from strict predictions. This leads us to the usual critiques of sociobiology. The first big one: where are the genes? Remember, for any trait to evolve via selection, it needs to be heritable, meaning it involves genes. But this is often forgotten. As Chapter 8 discussed, the idea of a single gene for aggression, intelligence, empathy, or even maximizing reproductive success by mating indiscriminately or abandoning kids is incredibly tenuous. So critics will demand, show me the gene that you assume is there. And sociobiologists often respond, show me a more parsimonious explanation than this assumption. It's a fair challenge demanding concrete genetic evidence for complex behavioral traits. The next major challenge addresses the tempo of evolutionary change. A basic premise of much sociobiological thinking is that evolution is gradual incremental. As selective pressure slowly shifts, beneficial gene variants become more common. Enough changes accrue and you get a new species. Dinosaurs gradually turn into chickens, mammals emerge as glands slowly evolve into milk, thumbs increasingly oppose in proto-primates. Evolution is gradual, continuous. But in 1972, Stephen Jay Gould and paleontologist Niles Eldredge proposed a radical alternative: punctuated equilibrium. They argued evolution isn't gradual. Most of the time, nothing happens. Evolution occurs in intermittent, rapid, dramatic lurches. This idea was anchored in paleontology. Fossil records often show long periods of stasis, unchanged forms, punctuated by rapid transitions. What triggers these punctuated events? A sudden, massive selective factor, an evolutionary bottleneck, killing most of a species, leaving survivors with obscure traits that become vital. Why does this challenge sociobiological thinking? Because gradualism implies every tiny fitness difference matters, every slight advantage translates into evolutionary change. If instead, evolution is mostly stasis, much of the detailed discussion about optimizing behavior becomes largely irrelevant. The sociobiologists weren't amused. They called the PE people jerks. The P folks called them creeps. Get it? Gradualists fired back with strong rebuttals. First, they're just snail shells. Yes, there are complete fossil lineages showing gradualism, especially for vertebrates like primates. PE proponents often focus on invertebrates like trilobites or snails, whose fossil records might be more complete. Second, how fast do their eyes blink? Paleontologists see long periods of stasis followed by rapid changes. But a paleontological blink could be 50,000 to 100,000 years, plenty of time for gradual evolution. Third, they're missing the important stuff. P focuses on bones and shells. It ignores the interesting stuff: brains, hormones, enzymes, neurotransmitters, the molecular machinery driving behavior. Maybe the pelvis evolved punctuatedly, but the pituitary gland did too, but at different times. Overlap these punctuated patterns and it looks gradualist overall. Fourth, where's the molecular biology? Gradualists pointed to micromutation, point mutations, insertions, deletions as the engine of gradualism. But P needs mechanisms for rapid change. Recent decades provided answers: macromutations like gene duplications, regulatory changes affecting when where genes are expressed, epigenetics. Stasis itself implies conservatism. Random mutations are often disastrous. Luck is needed for beneficial large changes. Finally, show us some actual rapid change. Plenty exists. Belyev's foxes bred for tameness in 35 generations. Feral Moscow dogs evolving wolf-like traits. Lactase persistence spreading rapidly in dairy-consuming populations. The ACE-PM gene variant spreading in the last 1,800 years. Malaria resistance genes, human metabolic adaptation to Western diets observed in real time. Evolution happens fast sometimes. So the conclusion? Both gradualism and punctuated change occur in evolution. It's probably context-dependent, maybe depending on the genes involved. Perhaps brain-related genes evolve faster than others. And no matter how rapid the changes, there's always some degree of gradualism. No female has ever given birth to a member of a new species overnight. A great example of gradual adaptation under constant conditions comes from Richard Lenski's decades-long work with E. coli bacteria, cultured for 58,000 generations, roughly a million years of human evolution. Over that time, different colonies evolved distinctive adaptations gradually. Thus, both modes of evolution are real. The final major challenge, laced with politics, is everything adaptive? Adaptationism assumes that prevalent traits evolved because they were adaptive in the past. Much sociobiological thinking leans adaptationist. This drew scathing criticism, notably from Gould and Lewontin, who mocked it as just so stories, plausible but untestable tales explaining why zebras have stripes or giraffes have long necks. They accused sociobiology of explaining too much and predicting too little. Gould introduced the concept of exaptation, Traits evolve for one reason and are later co-opted for another. Feathers predate flight, evolving for insulation. Or, traits might be spandrels, architectural spaces between arches, inevitable byproducts of building the arches. They weren't designed for the artwork placed in them. Gould and Lewontin argued male nipples are spandrels, baggage carried along from female development with no adaptive purpose in males. Numerous traits prompting just so stories, they claimed, were merely spandrels. Sociobiologists responded. Pronouncing something a spandrel wasn't inherently more rigorous, it was just a just not so story. Adaptationism, they argued, did make predictions, like predicting competitive infanticide based on social structure or inferring a species' mating system from sexual dimorphism. Evidence of complex convergent solutions also pointed to adaptation. But the real heat came from the political undercurrents, captured in Gould and Lewontin's title, referencing Voltaire's Dr. Pangloss, the Panglossian paradigm. This accused adaptationism of the naturalistic fallacy, assuming if nature produces something, it must be good, and that goodness in a biological sense implies moral goodness. It implied using biology to justify the status quo, conservative social Darwinism. Critics use the is versus ought distinction. Sociobiologists imply that when an unfair feature of life is the case, it is because it ought to be. Sociobiologists flipped it. We agree life ought to be fair, but nonetheless this is reality. Saying we advocate something just because we report it is like saying oncologists advocate cancer. The conflict was personal too. Early American sociobiologists were often white Southerners, while their loudest critics were Northeastern Jewish leftists. Punctuated equilibrium, with its emphasis on revolutionary leaps, also resonated with dialectical materialism, adding another layer of ideological battle. So, where does this leave us? The field has moved towards a sensible middle ground. There's clear evidence for both gradualism and punctuated change, and for molecular mechanisms underlying both. There's less adaptation than extreme adaptationists claim, but fewer spandrels than spandrelites tout. Sociobiology may explain too much and predict too little, but it does predict broad features across species. Neogroup selection is probably rare but likely important in humans. All this rests on evolution being a fact, albeit a wildly complex one. Biology is repeatedly about propensities, potentials, vulnerabilities, predispositions, interactions, modulations, context dependencies. Circles and loops and spirals. No one said this was easy, but the subject matters. And this leads us to explore realms where these evolutionary principles matter most. The fundamental human tendency to divide the world into us and them.